Our guest today is Casey, a father, musician, and founder who turned heartbreak into hope. After his daughter was diagnosed with a rare disease, he shifted from writing songs to pioneering treatments, building a future where families like his don't have to hear, "There's nothing we can do." Casey, thanks so much for being here, man.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, excited to chat.
Me too.
You have been a musician and now you run a biotech company. And I'm sure there's a million things in between that we'll get to as well. But I'm curious, could you have ever foreseen where you sit in life now and what you do for a living?
No, I mean, if you told me what I would be doing now, I would have told you that you've got the wrong guy, for sure.
Let's go back. Let's go to the beginning. What was your early beginnings, your childhood, your upbringing? What did that look like?
Yeah, I think it actually has a lot to do with how I ended up here. None of us have been a kid except for our first time, or a parent except for our first time, and I was raised south of Houston in a small Texas town near the coast. And I went to public school till about third grade. And then my mom decided to homeschool me, which I think had a big impact on how I learned today, And so I was taking, really gravitated towards music. So I was taking classical piano I guess I did that for about 10 years and became a pretty good classical pianist at an early age and it was homeschooled. So most of my learning would be scheduled learning, but I would need to teach myself. And then my mother would give me, feedback or grade my testing. So I had to learn how to learn, and knowing that if I could learn something faster, I had more time to go play, outside was a good incentive for me to learn something faster, instead of just do the minimal work. Also, as a kid, I was doing music because I loved that. And then I was taking radios apart and TVs apart. And, Radio Shack was a big thing then when I was growing up. So I'd go to Radio Shack and get a bunch of, logic chips and circuit boards and things and learn how to solder them. And so there was this engineering nerd in me and also this composer that was being developed at an early age. But, when I saw my first music video, these dudes making, money playing music, when I learned that, I was like, all right, Mom, that's what I'm going to do with my life. I want to learn how to make a career in music. So the idea that you could teach yourself anything, and that immediately, around 16, I start interning at a recording studio and learning how to run that, tape machines, digital recording, a lot of big soundboards and really expensive microphones and things. And so, this sort of trajectory, what no one told me was how difficult the music business was going to be. But I just assumed that you went into a career of something that you loved because you were inspired by it. I didn't, because I hadn't gone to, I think, a public high school. So I didn't have this sort of path of saying, all right, your next thing is to choose a degree and choose a university and figure out the job you wanted to have. It was more of what do you want to do with your life, And I think homeschooling gave me the opportunity to explore what that was. Now, I couldn't talk to girls, when I graduated high school, which was a problem. But it allowed me to just jump into a career and learn a new thing if I wanted to.
Do you think things would have been different if you had gone through the public schooling throughout grade 12 or whatever the case may be?
Yeah, I absolutely do. One of the things I've learned over time is that it's easy for us to get institutionalized as human beings. You see it in religion. I'm a pretty spiritual guy, but being in different sort of, whether I hang out with my Muslim friends or Hindu friends or Buddhist friends or Christian friends, there is a level of institutionalization or calcification that can happen in religion that says things have to be this way, and if they're not this way, they're wrong. And I think the same thing happens with how do we learn How do we find out what we want to do with our lives? How do we build a business or get a career? And so when you're told over and over and over again that go to college, get a degree, get a job, pay off your student loans, start a family, but like you can pretty much map out 75% of humans' existence, with what we tell ourselves is the way to do it. So I think that lack of institutionalization has helped me. But I'm sure there's things I'm calcified on because you don't really know you are when you are.
You don't know what you don't know.
You don't know what you don't know.
Yeah, yeah. So you go and you start this career in music from the recording studio. Did you have friends? I'm curious, did you have friends at the same time that maybe went through the public school system? And how did that kind of dynamic work? Because you were kind of coming from two different streams, I suppose, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have a lot of friends. When you're in a class where you're the only one in your grade, it is kind of hard to make friends. But the friends I did have all went to universities, and so they left, around that time. And I tried to go take some classes, but it was very difficult for me to learn by someone just telling me, read this book and do this and then take this test. Like, I just don't learn very well that way. And so while they are building their careers through education, and some of them have gone off and done great things, I'm not knocking universities. For me, it was a different path. And I was learning how to start a band, and so I eventually moved to Austin to do that, to Austin, Texas, because it was the only city in Texas that sort of had a really good music community. And, like I may have mentioned before, we all, found our band members. We all moved into a house, turned the extra bedroom into a rehearsal room, and each of us lived off of, $500 a month in order to start this band. What I didn't realize was that starting a band really meant starting a business that was going to fail over and over and over and over again before we actually saw any success.
It's a really interesting likening of two scenarios, right? Like, I think a lot of businesses look at these things and they're like, oh, well, business goes bankrupt, on to the next, or whatever the case. But it's almost like in a band, you don't go bankrupt. You just got to find the next gig.
Yeah, I mean, you're bankrupt the entire time, and so, I remember booking our own tours, and, we had bought a van because the bass player's parents gave us a couple of grand, and then we saved up another couple of grand. And so we had this, at one time it was an ice cream van that we were touring in that had, no seats. And so we put lawn chairs in there, and it was just, you were like, can we afford gas? And then can we afford a hotel room at like a Motel 8? And if we couldn't afford a hotel room, one of the band members was tasked with finding a girl at the show that liked him to take him home. And then he would be like, surprise, my band is actually going to come with me. So sort of like a fishing expedition so that we all had a place to sleep that night. Otherwise we were sleeping in the van. And so it was, it was the best of times and the worst of times, with no resources, but it would get us from Austin to Houston to Louisiana, Louisiana to Arkansas or Mississippi. We would just sort of start making those rounds.
In these early stages of these tours, was it always guaranteed that you would have a place to play in these cities that you're touring around, or was it kind of up in the air?
Yeah, I mean, this was how we would make our money, is we would get a guarantee, and with early bands like we were, you maybe get a guarantee for $500. And sometimes you'd only play to the bartender, and sometimes the venue did great and would pack the house. And so all the clubs would usually pay you. There was one club that we ended up drinking more at the club than they were actually paying. And so they said we owed them money. And that was a difficult experience, but if we could sell CDs and t-shirts, because that was before, everything was streamed, then that sort of gave us enough money to get there. So I'd have these spreadsheets of like target money that we need to make. And this was like the development of my business sense, was was, how do we create a margin here of revenue, even with tiny bits of money, to get us from one city to the next, to build something?
Did you have the foresight, like, to realize at the time when you started doing these spreadsheets, when you were doing all the analysis, when you were leading these bands, to realize that you were, the reflection is 100% you were learning business. But did you know at the time?
I didn't think about it that way. I thought about, I need to pay my rent. I'm afraid I'm going to run out of food. We need to buy some time in the recording studio. And so everything was sort of organically built. Like, what do we need to do? Well, we need to make a plan. Oh crap, how do we do that? So we learned how to make a plan. And so a lot of these business skills came out of that. And I will say, like, on top of all this, during this sort of formidable time, or this developing time for me in my early 20s at this point, I had also experienced an immense amount of tragedy by losing my brother and father to suicide within a span of like 4 years. So I'm trying to build this band and going through this immense amount of grief and not really knowing how to deal with it, So on top of this, it's like a lot of drinking, a lot of getting arrested, a lot of just back then too, you were sort of respected more for excess as an artist, which is a real shame, because now if you do yoga and you're vegetarian and you work out before your show, you're like a more respected artist, which is great. It's great because artists can live way healthier than they used to. But back then it was sort of, you were allowed to be a mess, and then as we experienced more and more success and we had managers and booking agents, things started to grow. It became easier and easier to be codependent on these people to rescue me from whatever excess, was going on. And it was really interesting because my band had sort of reached this peak where we're selling our own records, and we had an indie label for a little while, but I couldn't grow and I didn't know why. And we kept playing in front of labels and I didn't know why they wouldn't sign us. And it wasn't until I got sober and really like learned how to grieve. If you don't grieve, you're just saving it for some other time. I didn't know that I could turn pain into purpose at that time. And so, I joined some mental health organizations on the board, started raising money. I got sober. And then within a year, I have a major label record deal. We've got a top 10 hit on the radio, top 10 VH1 video. We're getting huge guarantees. I played Red Rocks, like things just, my life completely changed as soon as I started dealing with my personal problems in a more open way, and I think all of that really prepared me for the next chapter of my life, which was Rose, and I think that it gave me grit. It gave me an understanding of how to take suffering and channel it into something that was healthy. And it gave me an expectation that I'm going to fail a lot and I'm going to have to learn a lot of things I don't understand, and it's okay,
What was the timeline between this life of excess and these losses that you experienced in your life to the time where you decided to, turn that purpose into pain, turn that pain into purpose, to use your words?
Yeah. So no, I turned purpose into pain first. No, so lost my dad and brother between 19 and 23. And that's really where things kind of, I'm managing the money, which is like not good when you're drinking a lot, or doing drugs, whatever. And so kind of going through this between 23 and 27, 28, and getting sober and going through therapy and like kind of learning how a person heals from this crazy stuff. And then experiencing this huge like success right before my 30s. And then I got married and married a childhood friend and had two beautiful kids. So I have this music career, and then I started a couple of companies, and real estate started sort of venturing out as a young dad because I also wanted to have other income streams so I could stay home more and be dad, kind of through my 30s, and then having, you know, my two girls sort of late 30s, was when kind of that everything started changing with Rose.
Were you surprised at the rate of how quickly things could change when you basically made an active choice to do so?
Yeah, I was. You know, I didn't realize, like, I don't think we realize, even me now, you could say I'm healthy compared to how I was, but what are those growth pieces? What are those things that we all hold on to as founders or fathers or mothers or you know, whatever our job description might be or the thing we're doing in life, you know, what are those belief systems we have that are holding us back, you know? And so it was clear to me that by letting some of those go, that the world changes around you, you know? And when this new tragedy arrives with my daughter, it was almost as if I knew exactly what to do because my body and my mind had done it before, you know? I may not have known how to do it, but I knew what to do, you know?
You were prepared for it through previous experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think all those things really prepared me for this.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So your daughter Rose is born, and you experienced a diagnosis. Walk me through that.
You know, Rose was born fairly normal. You know, there's always weird complications, or things that, you know, are different for each kid. And so, but, you know, we started noticing she was choking on her food. She wasn't walking. And I was having to give her enemas, you know, because she was getting really constipated. And she was screaming a lot. She had 3 words she could say early on: mom, dad, and outside. And when she stopped talking, that's when we knew that whatever the pediatrician was telling us, whatever tests they were doing, was not enough. There was something very, very wrong. So we ordered a genetic sequence on her, and I didn't know what I was looking at. It was, you know, it was a group of letters called HNRMPH2, which is the name of the gene. I took it to the pediatric neurologist because I had to order it privately. He didn't even suggest it. And he said, yeah, you know, Casey, your daughter has a rare genetic disease. There is no cure. There's nothing we can do. Her future is really pretty uncertain. He gave me an autism diagnosis because, you know, a lot of these neurogenetic diseases in kids look like autism to some degree. And so we were able to enroll her into some programs to help her because it was a neurodevelopmental disease. So I immediately went home and felt like my trajectory of Rose was not going to be what it would be for a normal girl. She's never going to get married. She's never going to go to college. She's never going to go to parties and play with her friends. She was never going to wonder what she was going to do with her life. She's never going to be accepted into society, you know, and that really was a really hard pill to swallow, you know. So I spent maybe the first year kind of grieving about that. And, you know, I think that the thing I was faced with was that this was actually a global health crisis, that just because it was a rare disease, there's over 10,000 rare diseases. Most of them are too rare for pharma to commercialize with their model. And that's over 400 million people. And only 5% of these treatments actually have, or 5% of these diseases actually have treatments. So this was like a huge problem. This is bigger than the population of the United States, you know, these people that suffer like this. We called it autism or special needs or CP, but, you know, but we're seeing now with all these genetic diseases that, like, our diseases we used to call these blanket statements are actually a bunch of tiny diseases with different genetic mutations and the code of what makes us up. And so I was sort of faced with, can I do anything about that? Because I am her dad, you know, isn't my job to protect my daughter? If there was a monster or a someone trying to take her or a car, you know, I would literally sacrifice my life for her. Why wouldn't I do that, you know, with this? Just because I was homeschooled and I didn't know jack about genetics, you know, like, all right, well, let's start making some phone calls, you know? And so I Googled parent cures child of rare genetic disease. That's how it started. Just to see. if anyone had ever attempted this before. Sure enough, over the last decade, genetic technology had gotten to the place where parents could either raise money or use their own money, build treatments, and get treatments into a clinical trial. And wealthy parents were doing this. And then foundations that were sort of more modern were raising the money to do this. And one in particular, Julia Vitarello, was speaking all over the world. And her and Dr. Tanu had created Milicin, a single drug for her daughter Mila. And they did it in less than a year and treated her in a trial. So it was super inspiring. I'm like, oh my God, if these people can do it, I can learn how to do this. So that's sort of what started me on the journey of like, this is possible. So let's figure it out.
That attitude is not one that most people have. So, I mean, I'm going full circle here, but I mean, from the homeschooling to the struggles with band to the early loss, all of these things, do you think that you said you're spiritual as well. Do you think that all led to that moment that said, I can do this and I'm meant to?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if I think about all the impossible things that have already happened in my life, the bad ones and the good ones, like, man, how many more, shitty things are going to happen to me, but at the same time, it also felt like a challenge of like, it was like a gift I was given. The same with the suicide of my family of like, how are you going to get through this? Because if you do, it changes you forever. You become this person you never would have become without that kind of pain and struggle. I mean, I don't know about you, but like, if things are going well, I don't purposefully try to make things harder for myself,
Yeah.
But most often, all the great things that we learn or become come from struggle, and this duality of thinking that pain and suffering is bad and being wealthy and insulated from happy and joyful and free is good. I think this duality is incorrect, because I have experienced joy out of all these shitty things that happen. So that definitely gave me like, do I know this? Is this like, am I prepared to make drugs and start a biotech company? Absolutely not. But can I learn? For sure. My dad always taught me that having mentors in your life was like crucial, no matter how old you were. And that was another part of the music. As soon as I started talking to more successful artists, was a big, after I got sober, was also a big part of that. So I probably talked to 200 academic researchers, CEO of biotech companies. This was like pandemic time. So everybody started Zooming. So I could get a hold of people relatively easy without spending any money. And then Ultragenics, this really incredible biotech company, rare disease, began to put on a boot camp for families that want to do drug development. It's like a 3-day event. And they taught you how to manage these genetic, programmable medicine programs if your disease was amenable to it. So I was just surrounded by drug developers, had some, start taking genetic classes online. And I thought, okay, I think we can do this, and I started a foundation. I started the Takira Rose Foundation because who was going to invest in me at this point? Nobody really invests in preclinical assets or, drugs that aren't in the clinic yet, without any intellectual property. So I started the foundation, started learning how to raise money, build a board, and recruit scientists. That was sort of the first step. We just get the community together. But what I quickly realized is the system was so broken because what's happening is that parents and even most biotech companies in pharma, they license drugs out of an academic lab. That means the academic institution owns the intellectual property of this drug. These are billion-dollar drugs, right? So they take this little royalty, they maintain the IP, but they also take 5-10 years to make this thing, We don't have that time. And none of these kids have this time. This is level of urgency that is very different. This isn't about it being just a business. This is about like, these kids are suffering how quickly can we do this? So I tried to negotiate with some universities around this, and they wanted me to give them hundreds of thousands of dollars, and then they were going to own everything. And so this is how you do it. You know, you pay them to do this research, and then they own it all. And then the other problem was that they started they will license these drugs to a pharma or a biotech company. Well, if it's an ultra rare disease, the only value for the pharma company is having more IP and increasing their share price. The chances of them actually commercializing this drug are actually pretty low. So all these drugs, some even in the clinic, were getting shelved, and kids were dying. And it blew my mind. These gene therapies and like the technology we use, ASOs or these RNA drugs. So I'm like, well, I can't give up the ownership of this. Like I could do, you know, I met parents that spent millions of dollars on a treatment, and then biotech licensed it and shelved it, and their kid dies. You know, like I didn't want to go through that. So we started a lab here in Austin. It's called Rare Labs. And the idea was, could we make these drugs super fast, cheaper, and do it for Rose, but also do it for a lot of other families? And that was my first successful business. It's working with over a dozen families. We made over 4, you know, drugs there. And that's where I really cut my teeth on the process of making cell lines, designing the drugs, and working with these just brilliant scientists that it's like making a record, you know, but they're the rock stars in this, you know, in this situation. So I will never forget being in the lab and seeing Rose's neurons that we made out of her stem cells, and then watching how they look different than a typical neuron, and then seeing the data of the ASO we made that rescues function in human neurons, and knowing that this drug is going to work. So at this point, we got a foundation, have a lab, and we have a drug now that works in neurons and mice, you know, that we decided to call McPherson. But I realized that this was actually the easy part. So, you know, that's
the easy part. That's wild. Yeah.
So at this point, I'm sort of faced with a fork in the road. Rose is starting to have seizures now. She died for about 3 minutes, you know, which is pretty consistent with the disease of dying. Some of these kids die from these seizures, and they get them around 8. She's 9 now. And so I'm like, how do I get this drug into a clinical trial? If I do it through the foundation, there's no real sustainable model. It's never going to be commercialized. And there's no other company in the world that's going to take this drug on, because it only has 100 known patients, 150 known patients. So I'm like, all right, it's time to start a company. So we spun out of the foundation a public benefit corporation called Alpharose Therapeutics. And we worked on a business model. What does it look like to commercialize a bunch of these ultra rare drugs, starting with McPherson? And then what could we do differently that would make this more accessible? So we started thinking about this thing we call genetic surgery or process approval. No more clinical trials. Could we prove that our technology is safe 70, 80% of the time? Could we do away with all the gigantic animal testing, do something that made more sense, still maintain some level of safety? But could we get insurance companies to pay for these drugs immediately instead of waiting 5, 10 years in a clinical trial? And so we built this company with the model of like, we can do these one at a time and they'll make money. They won't be $1 billion drugs. They'll be $10 million drugs, $50 million drugs, $100 million drugs. And they'll, you know, just like selling CDs, they cost less than they do. You know, you can make them for less than you sell them. So that's a real business. And then if we get the process approval, then all the hospitals could be making these, you know, sequencing patients, making these medicines and treating them in days instead of decades. And that's the dream. And I always want to do something for more than just Rose and me, you know. And the other thing we did, which I think was really cool, is we licensed McPherson from the foundation. So once that gets to revenue, the foundation will be able to make and fund the next big drug, the better version, or, and make some sustainability. But this is a new model. I don't know if it's going to work, but that creative energy of like, the old model definitely doesn't work. Our healthcare system's really broken. And so we need to build new models that are built around patients like Rose, not around, guys in private jets, with custom suits, because largely our model is built around those guys right now, and I'm hoping that, we can change that. And Rose gave this to me, she gave me this trajectory, and here I am now, CEO of a biotech company, trying to learn how to raise capital, run teams, and stay compliant.
There's a lot to dive into there, but I'm going to start here. You mentioned that the first step was to kind of rally this community around you, right? And as I'm sitting across from you right now, listening to your story, I mean, logically in my head, there's nobody who wouldn't resonate with what you're saying, Like, it just doesn't make any sense. So the first step to be, let's counter this system, let's figure out a better way, seems logical. I'm curious as to the resistances that you've felt along the way, or maybe the barriers that you're experiencing right now, because I can't imagine anybody who's hearing your story isn't like, how can I help? How can I support?
You would think. The first big barrier was vulnerability. I'm a fairly vulnerable person, but it was harder for me to be vulnerable about Rose. It was almost a feeling as if I had somehow already failed her because she had this disease that I could not fix. So sharing that pain in order to raise money and build a community, I think honesty and vulnerability, transparency are like really crucial to like intimate relationships. But they also put you in this place of feeling like, oh, I don't look perfect. I don't look great. I don't have it together. I'm broken. Well, welcome to the club. I mean, it's funny how our brains work, and we convince ourselves we're something more than we are, and we're not. We're just human, just like everybody else. So that was the first thing. And then imposter syndrome, they talk about like, you can't do this. The critic, let's say we're made of parts, and we all have a part that's like a critic, and he or she is going, who do you think you are to think you can do this? You need to be more realistic, And then I've got people at very well-known universities and hospitals that I won't mention because I don't feel like it's necessary, but that would tell me to stay in my lane. You're a patient advocate. Leave the drug development up to the professionals. And I would simply tell them, well, if you'd already made a drug for my daughter, then I wouldn't be here, And so I've had companies, and I've had people tell me that, stop, you don't know what you're doing, And that vulnerability has acquired a team of people that are also mission driven. And I have some of the best drug developing scientists in the world working for me now, guys that care about the patients and are up till 2 a.m. scratching their heads trying to solve the problem, So I don't know. I think that, and then fundraising is just really hard. I don't like selling stuff. I'm always afraid I'm going to be this car salesman, and I'm like, and so I don't like asking people for things, and so it was hard to raise donations in the foundation because it dealt with this fear of rejection and like, what are people going to think about me? But then the company side with capital, there's this level of like ego in venture capital that's just gross, not everybody, but a lot of people. And I don't respond well to that. I had already been through that in my band, the pride had cometh before the fall, and I fell flat on my face. But so the fundraising aspect has been difficult, but I think finding the people that align with the core of your mission is more important than getting what you need. If I look at the major label experience, I gave up a lot of who I was during that time. It was a division of Disney, and I let go of some of my creativity, some of like who I was. They were dressing me, they were telling me what to say, they're asking me to date people. That wasn't me, So I think holding on to the core of who you are, believing that part of that is what's got you here. And even if someone says no to you, it just means they're the wrong person, while still being open to learning how to do it better.
Yeah. I'm thinking back to when you said that the diagnosis first came about and you had this idea to challenge the system and figure out a way to make this change. And it sounded like you had, you'd experienced enough in your life to feel confident that you were capable of doing something. You were going to ask the right questions, you were going to knock on the right doors, and you were going to do something. I'm curious if there was another definitive moment somewhere along the line, because you went from there to, then producing a drug and everything that happened in between. Was there a definitive moment along that process where you found the conviction that, you know what, this is possible, and beyond Rose, I'm going to do it for other people as well?
Yeah, for me, it's really important that I never have something to fall back on when I'm doing something. I know that our parents tell us, and logic suggests that if you're going to go follow your dreams, do it responsibly. But I just don't think that works very well, at least not for me. I need to be in a place where I have no net, because it forces me on the days that I don't believe I can do it, on the days it feels too hard that I can't turn around, And so when I had a record deal from Sony sitting on my desk, and I had to make a decision, like to re-up for this or do this deal. I had to make a decision between going this way or signing a really great opportunity, with my music career. And I knew I couldn't do both because I wouldn't put in everything I needed to. So I think that was the first monumental moment for me that said, I'm all in. It's not that I think I can figure it out, it's that I have to, And I think the other was the scientists that I became really, really deeply connected with, learning how possible, how incredible the technology we have is, and seeing that, we're not actually this is way easier than going to Mars, In some ways, it's easier than becoming a successful band. The metrics of risk around the failure of the technology that we are using for these diseases and becoming a successful artist has an extra 0.0 to it, And so I'm like, I didn't know how to do that. I don't know how to do this. Maybe grit has a lot to do with this too. So I think that was part of it. And the other was after we made Rose's drug and saw that it was working in neurons and cells, and then we made someone else's, another family had a child with a different disease, and we made a drug for them, seeing that working preclinically too. I knew that there was so much purpose in this, and that there was no other lab in the world like us that was serving these families, that even academic institutions getting hundreds of millions of dollars a year couldn't pull off what we're pulling off just because their system is calcified. I knew that we could change this, and that I was maybe the right person for the job because I was naive enough to believe it could, but creative enough to see around the corner. I hadn't been institutionalized.
I'm getting stuck on this idea that you were told so many times to stay in your lane, and that, if the chance of success, if it is possible as you've experienced, then why is it so gatekept?
There's a thing called the hero complex. And there's also, I think, a thing around fear of change. Growing up in a very conservative Christian environment and watching the institutionalized side of like religion be very scared if something changed. We also see that in racism. You know, a lot of people are scared of racism. Can sometimes stem from just like a lack of understanding of that culture. You know, if it's a cultural kind of thing. We see that between Republicans and Democrats. You know, it's sort of the polarity of beliefs. Someone has to be wrong for someone else to be right. And so I think when we think in that level of duality, I think it forces us to create an us and them moment. And what I saw was also a fear of taking away people's purpose. And if my identity was wrapped up in saving Rose and saving these kids, then I'm not always going to be making the right decisions for them. You know, same with a lot of these big time people in hospitals, and they felt, in my opinion, threatened. Because if we change the system, then maybe the system that they use isn't working as well as it should, which in their minds means maybe they're doing something wrong. And that is not something we want to feel, you know? So I think it's kind of complex in that way, but I think it's a human journey to be self-aware enough to like, are we okay with being wrong? Are we okay with not finding identity in what we do? You know, are we okay with not approaching things dualistically? All these things to me are core beliefs I have to sort of how I view the world and why I was able to forgive those assholes, you know, for the most part.
Yeah. You're dealing with timelines that are extremely sensitive. Obviously, these pressures that are self-imposed to a point, but there's timelines on these things, right? The longer it takes to do something, the later it is that this person could be cured or affected in a positive way. That's a lot of pressure on you, on your team, on the prioritization of what you decide to work on. How does that affect you, and how do you choose to prioritize the next thing?
It's a great question. I mean, initially, I didn't handle it very well. I don't know that I always handle it very well. I think I was scared of being a CEO of a biotech company because I was afraid of the pressure it might put on me. But I think I'm realizing again is that we're not perfect human beings. And I think there's a level of acceptance that if you do everything you possibly can, you should be okay with, like, if you're pushing yourself, you're learning, you surrounded yourself with experts, you know, you're doing everything that you can and focus on kind of changing for the better, then whatever happens, happens. You know, I think this idea where we're dead set on an arrival at something doesn't mean we don't have goals. Like, I have a goal. I want to eradicate rare genetic disease with my company. You know, I'm not going to be like, you could say that I'm only going to be happy when I get there, but we know that that's not true. You know, I think it's the work that we do every single day in that moment that is what's important. And then if we do that enough times in the smart enough way, surrounded by the right people with the right plan, that we get closer and closer to that destination or that goal, which initially is treating Rose for me, you know, and building all these treatments for all these other diseases and treating all these other kids. But I am not a hero. You know, I am not a Superman. You know, I am one guy who used to be a broke-ass musician that has a vision and a mission. And if I can't see the value in every single person around me, that it's us and that gets us there, or maybe not. I don't know if that makes sense. It's the arrival is not, it's the goal, but I'm focused on today and tomorrow, you know?
Yeah, there's a common thread, I suppose, if you will, among people who are doing the right thing to do the right thing. I want to say leaders of nonprofits and that sort of thing, but I don't know that that's generally true. So basically that ego is not the right word, but that imposter syndrome is very easily dropped because you know that you're doing everything you possibly can to achieve a result. And the more that you do that and the more that you push through that, the more community you're building around yourself and the more that you're, the closer you're getting to that end result.
Yeah, I mean, now as a company, one of the big things is that I know that if I can make investors money, I can treat more kids. I know if I can treat kids, I can make investors money. And so there's this marriage of profit and impact that I'm okay with, because we live in a capitalistic society. And if this stayed in a nonprofit environment, it would never scale, and people just, would just continue to dump money into a big black hole, and so it's now, I think the pressure I feel is, can I raise enough money and time to like save as many kids as we can? And then can I save enough kids to make these investors money so that the world sees how lucrative personally and professionally standing up companies like ours is for these, diseases. So I think ultimately that's my goal, is to prove out this business model since it's new and treat as many kids as we can. And, again, I'm not great at everything. And so I get to be surrounded by people that are great at a lot of other things, that I'm not. So it's definitely like it's a family, it's a team.
Yeah.
Yeah.
From the get-go, starting the business, there's certain things that you can anticipate are going to be the hard parts, right? Like raising money is always complicated. Communicating the message is equally as complicated. Actually having a viable product is complicated, all these things. What do you think was the hardest part that you couldn't have foreseen?
I think the hardest part for me was realizing how institutionalized the investment community was. I thought investors invest in new ideas that make financial sense. What I didn't realize in healthcare is it had become so calcified. You find the drug that's going to be worth billions of dollars a year, and you spend $500 million to $1 billion on developing it over the period of a decade, and it's got a 5% chance of success. And that is the model that venture capital invests in. And so it's very similar to major labels in that it's not about patient health. It's not about how the world is affected by it. It's not about building an ecosystem or changing a model or anything. It's about investing in 10 multi-billion-dollar plays, or 20 or 50, and needing only one or two of them to work. It's a very amoral way of investing. And labels do this too. So if you listen to music on the radio, do you think it's the most creative music in the world? No. Do you think that these artists are the best artists in the world that are getting ultra famous? Absolutely not. I wouldn't even call a lot of the people on the radio artists, call them they're not necessarily like songwriters or like creating music that has never been made before. They're creating a product. They are products of major labels. And so it's been said, major labels look for artists that kind of fall into this middle grade that they believe they can turn into this really great product. And they only need 1 in 10 to work. So I think that was the biggest surprise for me, is I'm spending a lot of my time now on doing something I absolutely hate, which is financial modeling and research with some economists, healthcare economists and CFOs, so we can publish our business model to show people like, this is real. This is how it works. And it's a better model than our current one. But I just never expected that. I certainly never expected me to be spending that much time on something like that.
It's so fascinating that you find this system, or you find this business, or whatever the case may be, that you can really get behind, that truly counters or questions what's been done in the past. And it's clear by what you just said that you just want this to become the standard. It's not about your business doing it, or
No.
It's about replicating this so that we can create a new standard in this sphere.
Yeah, I mean, we're at, like I said, 10,000 known genetic diseases. We're discovering hundreds every year, and we're only maybe treating a handful. So it's winning. And then when non-coding regions of the gene, which we're about to see, are causing disease as well, scientists are saying we expect maybe a 10x of currently known genetic diseases. Alzheimer's, ALS, all these diseases with names, or there's cancer. Most of these are all genetic mutations, genetic anomalies and gene expression issues and stuff. And so if we don't change, we're going to be a sick world and continue to treat symptoms. If we do change, we may be able to eradicate disease because we can control how our bodies are programmed. We can edit our code. We can fix our code. And yeah, the implications on that from dangerous possibilities, yes, are there. Just like any new technology, there's always dangerous implications, but like AI, But if there's that many diseases, no one company is going to fix this problem. I think there will be hundreds of companies like us out there at some point with new technologies to attack this, new ways of thinking about it, but the business model is relatively going to be the same.
It's Monday morning. I'm listening to this podcast right now, driving to work, and I'm touched. I'm moved by what you're saying and this possibility of this new future in this sphere. What can I do as the average person who's listening to this to push this narrative forward?
I'm always looking for investors that are moved, and I'm not taking money from people that are doing this for a transaction or just a mere transaction. I think it's very, very important. We've got over 100 investors now, and 3 major ones that I'm really, really excited to work with. These people really care about changing the system. That's one way, sharing it with friends, sharing this idea that we don't have to settle for the current model, that there is a new way to fix healthcare, bring down medicine costs, and enter into a new age of medicine, And if you don't know what it looks like, just open up an episode of Star Trek and watch them go to the planet, get some sort of, pathogen, go into the, sick bay and design a drug. Like, that's science fiction, but we have the technology today to be able to achieve that for some diseases. We just don't have the systems and business models to do it at any sort of, financial scale, or profitable scale. So, I think it's, to me, these children are forgotten. These families are suffering. Most get divorced. We think about genocide. We think about racism. We think about civil rights. If we have the technology, but we're not doing anything about it, and to me, it's no different than a genocide. We're killing these people off because we don't give a shit. And the more of us that can care about this and say, what can I do to help? Share it, post it, talk about it, invest in Alpharose. Like, the more we will get to, I think, this reality where these millions of children and patients have hope.
How's Rose doing today?
Rose is stable. She's on seizure meds, which obviously doesn't fix her disease, but she's been seizure free for some months now. We still monitor her heart rate and her oxygen levels at night. I can tell that she is trapped in her brain, but she is so strong. She has found ways to try to regulate the insanity that she feels by not being able to communicate. The explosions that are happening with her neurons and how they're firing, I kind of sort of imagine it being like you're drunk and then you're at a metal concert with like millions of flashing lights. So you've got this overexposure of, you know, sensory issues, and yet no ability, you know, to be able to really process it. And yet somehow she finds ways of communicating with me. She'll give me a hug. She'll play keys on the piano. I'll give her a harmonica at the end of the night sometimes, and I'll play on the guitar in the same key. And she'll just, you know, suck in and blow out on it. And those are moments that her and I have together. And, you know, maybe we can't talk to each other or play Monopoly, but we can still connect. And for that, you know, I'm pretty grateful.
Where's the best way for people to find you and what you're doing, learn more, get in touch, etc.?
Yeah, you know, you can go to the company site, alpharose.com. I'm pretty easy to reach at casey@alpharose.com, or I'm always posting on LinkedIn, you know, Facebook and whatnot. Can also go to the foundation, takiararose.org, you know, where the foundation's changing, like how are we going to help these other families? And so there's plenty of work to be done there too. But always up for a conversation, and anybody that wants to get involved, you know, let's build the army, and, you know, let's change the world.
Thank you, Casey.
Thanks for having me.
This has been awesome. Appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure.